Napoleonic Wars. Now that was, of course, about 90 years later, but during that period, the Scandinavia and Norway with it changed. As I mentioned, the king wasn't quite what he was. People realized the king was a person. He wasn't God or something close to it. And you couldn't always agree with what he said. Now, I think if you were a farmer, a regular farmer, you would be careful to say anything too much against the king. But for the aristocracy, there was definitely a big change. So the king didn't have the sort of the unchallenged position he had before. And as you can see from this, with 1814, and of course that was after the revolution in France and after the US liberated itself, revolution here, then democracy was in the air. You know, that was the big time for democracies. And that influenced all the Scandinavian countries. And Norway, of course, in 1840 did a constitution. We also tried to win our freedom, but in 1814, it was a short little battle, and that was it. So we didn't have the power to, or the strength to stay independent. And of course, Sweden was supported by every country, Russia and Great Britain being the two principal powers, because they had been on the winning side, so they had to be rewarded. And Denmark, of course, had been on Napoleon's side. And that was very unpopular, because Napoleonic Wars was, again, even more than the Great Nordic War, a time where Scandinavia or Denmark, Norway had very different interests. Denmark, of course, was land-bound, could be invaded from Germany, and Germany, well, there was no Germany, but German states were, at least for a large part of the war, very subservient to the French. You know, they dominated by the French. So they could march in. Norway, of course, that would be impossible, but they would have to go a very long way around to get to Norway. But Norway could be blockaded by Royal Navies, and Norway has always been more British-friendly than the other countries, mainly because we have both seafaring nations, etc. So when 1814, and when the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Norway was really the most democratic to a certain extent, even though it had started in all of the others. And I mentioned the different years, and this was from 1814 to the end of the century. So that was the furthest step toward what we call modern Norway. Now, I suggest if you have any questions, we could take that now about this period before we start with the 20th century and the next slide.
Well, I had sent you a chat. I don't know how that works, so you really see it, but I wasn't sure what the time frame for the Great Nordic War. You know, I heard you like 90 years before the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, sorry about that. It was from around 1700 to 1720. It lasted.
So was that Sweden and Norway and Denmark fighting over territory?
No, it was, well, yes, that too, but it really was Sweden. Around 1600, Denmark, Norway was the biggest or the most powerful Scandinavian country. And over the following century, Sweden became the powerful power broker in Scandinavia. And of course, Sweden then also included Finland and the Baltic republics. Now, having such a big country and still a fairly small population, there was a lot of envy, and the German states wanted some of these territories that belonged to Sweden in what is today Germany. And of course, Russia wanted to get Finland and or especially the Baltic republics. And Denmark, Norway, of course, the Danish king wanted to win back some of the areas he had lost over the centuries. And so they all sort of ratted themselves together and declared war. And Denmark was the first to invade the Sweden, but the Swedish army was probably the most effective, efficient army in Europe at the time, and they comprehensively knocked Denmark, Norway out of the war almost immediately. They won some incredible victories against the Russians. So things looked like they were going very well, and the Tsar actually wanted to get a peace agreement, but King Carl XII, the great warrior king, declined. So he won over the several years. He won some very good victories, and then suddenly had one big loss. And of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Scandinavian countries couldn't take the kind of losses that Russia, not least, but also the other nations took. But it was about a 21-year period of more or less. Sweden was continued that war, but Denmark, Norway was in and out, and the others, they were shifting alliances. But Sweden was essentially at war for 21 years.
Correct me if I understand, Sweden at that time was a serious naval power in terms of world politics.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. Scandinavia was very important to the seafaring nations, especially Great Britain, because of timber. Because the only two places, the European forests had basically been cut down. The same with the British forests. There was only two places to get it. It was in Scandinavia or in North America. Of course, North America you could get it from, but those days that was a long trip to sail around with big logs in your ship. So that was also the beginning of Norwegian industry beyond fishing. And we had what we call the timber barons. Some of the first really wealthy people in Norway, at least in sort of semi-modern times, that were not farmers, and they were called the timber barons. But during this whole period, from about 1524 to 1815, which was really 300 years, so actually more than that, almost 400 years of continuous warfare. It feels like that. It wasn't, of course. It was long periods of peace. But when you look back, it's almost like we were constantly at war. Norway, Denmark tended to have the upper hand in the sea battles, whereas Sweden tended to win the military battles. And if Sweden had, in that period, also been a naval power, had been as successful in naval affairs as they were in military, Scandinavian history would have been very different. And Norway and Sweden at least would probably have been one country. But there was a certain balance, and a couple of times when things were really bad for the Danish-Norwegian armed forces, they were saved by the Navy, the Danish-Norwegian Navy. Yes?
Jorgen, if I could ask a question. During the Napoleonic War, how were the population, the common life in Norway affected? Was it a real upheaval in Norway during the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, it was probably the worst period in Norwegian history, because I mean, again, in modern history you have the Black Death and stuff, but that's kind of quote unquote ancient history. But in the time where we kind of sort of talk about the Norway as a country, because Norway has never been able to grow all the food it needs. So they always have to import food. And what happened, of course, was the British Navy blockaded Norway. And Sweden was allied with England, and Norway, Denmark with Finland. So there was starvation in Norway. And very difficult times. And there was, of course, animosity towards Britain and Sweden, but even or at least as much towards Danish kings. But of course, the Danish king was in a very difficult position. If he alienated Napoleon, the Le Grand Armée would probably conquered Denmark in a fairly short time. And if he allied with them, well, Norway was on the ropes, and that's what happened. And there's a lot of books, and there's also a story about the guy called Terje Vigen, who lived in southern Norway, and his family was starving, so he took a boat and he rowed to Denmark, and got food. The Danes were definitely wanted to help, but they couldn't, because the Danish Navy had been completely destroyed by the Royal Navy. And then he rowed back, and unfortunately, when he came back, his family had starved to death or died from hunger. So it was a very difficult time in Norwegian history, and it was probably also one of the reasons that there wasn't too many people who cried when we were split from Denmark, because I think everybody, or at least people with a little bit, I don't want to say anything bad about farmers, but people who sort of were informed. I don't know what to call it. Remember, if you were a farmer in Norway, or northern Norway, or Norway and Sweden in those days, you lived a pretty isolated life, and we know that there was very little. There was very little interest, I think. I don't think a farmer in all these valleys and hills in Norway and Sweden really cared what king ruled them. Whoever taxed them the least was probably who they preferred. Yeah, so there was a lot of animosity towards Denmark, and they realized that Norway and Denmark, there really wasn't, too much. We had such different interests and alignments at different times. Okay, Okay, shall we go to the next slide? So